The mysterious warning. For years, the galaxy had whispered about the Boogeymen. They were a name spoken in fear, but no one knew the truth about them. Some said they were an ancient race. Others believed they were ghosts from a forgotten war. No one knew for sure, but everyone feared them. That is, until an unexpected signal reached the edge of the galaxy. On a faraway planet, a fleet of alien ships drifted in the dark void of space. The leader of this fleet, Commander Raxer, stared out into the stars from his ship's control room. His mind was focused on one thing: the strange signal they had intercepted. "This can't be real," he muttered to himself. "The Boogeymen, are they real?" His crew was nervous too. Some of them had heard the legends, stories about these creatures that haunted the galaxy. But what was most unsettling was that the signal they had picked up seemed to be coming from a remote planet, long thought to be abandoned. It had been silent for centuries. Yet now there was a faint, eerie pulse. A warning, a call. The message that came through was simple, but chilling. "The Boogeymen are awake. Leave this place or face your doom." Raxer's heart raced. He had heard the stories. The Boogeymen were not something anyone wanted to encounter. The message sounded like a joke at first, but it felt too real, too desperate. "We have to investigate," Raxer said, turning to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Vora. "I want the crew ready. We're going to that planet." The crew was uncertain, but they knew their commander was never one to back down. They had to go. They couldn't ignore a message like this. Hours later, their ships arrived near the planet's atmosphere. The world below was dark, covered in thick clouds. No life signs were detected. The planet was quiet, empty, or so it seemed. Raxer's ship descended slowly through the clouds, the dark mass of the planet looming beneath them. Every crew member was tense, waiting for something to happen. The moment the ship's landing gear touched the surface, there was a strange humming sound. It came from deep beneath the ground. The planet was far from dead. It had secrets that were waiting for them to uncover. "We've landed," Raxer's voice crackled through the ship's intercom. "Everyone, stay alert. We don't know what's waiting for us out there." As the crew stepped off the ship, they could feel the weight of the planet's silence. The air was thick, heavy, as if it was holding its breath. It wasn't like any world they had ever seen. The ground beneath their feet was hard, cracked, and jagged, as if something powerful had once shaken it. They walked in a tight formation, scanning the surroundings. The ruins of an ancient city lay ahead of them, barely visible in the dim light. Broken statues and crumbled buildings stood like forgotten monuments to an old civilization. This was once a thriving world, but now it was abandoned, or so they thought. Vora was the first to speak. "Commander, there's something strange about this place. It's too quiet. No signs of life. Nothing." Raxer nodded. He could feel it too. The air seemed charged, almost alive. It was as if something was watching them. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud crack. It sounded like something big had moved, but no one saw anything. The crew jumped at the sound, their weapons drawn and ready. "Did you hear that?" whispered one of the soldiers. "I did," Raxer said, his voice low. "Stay alert." The crew continued forward, passing through the ruins until they reached the center of what appeared to be an ancient temple. There, in the center of the room, was a large stone altar. It was covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly, like they were alive. Raxer's curiosity got the better of him. He approached the altar cautiously, running his fingers over the symbols. As he touched them, the entire room seemed to come alive. The air grew colder, and a strange energy filled the space. Then they heard it, the voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it quickly grew louder. "Leave, now, or you will never leave." The crew froze, looking around in fear, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" Raxer demanded. "Show yourself." But the only response was the deafening silence. The crew was on edge. They had all heard the voice, but none of them saw anything. Then, the ground shook beneath their feet. It was as if the planet itself was warning them. The symbols on the altar flashed brighter, and the crew backed away in panic. "We have to leave," shouted Vora. "This place is cursed." Raxor hesitated, looking at the altar. "No. There's something here. We need to understand what it is." The ground shook again, this time stronger. The air became thick with electricity. Then, as if on cue, the strange humming noise from earlier returned. This time, louder and more intense. It was coming from deep within the planet. "We have to get out," Raxor finally said, realizing they were no longer welcome. Now, the crew quickly made their way back to the ship, but the ground beneath them cracked open, and something moved in the shadows. It was fast, unseen, but powerful. Raxor could feel its presence, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. They ran, fear tightening their chests. As they reached the ship, Raxor took one last look at the dark ruins. The whispers of the Boogeymen seemed to follow them, echoing in the silence of space. "Commander," Vora said urgently, "we've made a huge mistake." Raxor didn't respond. He was already thinking about what they had just discovered. The Boogeymen weren't just a myth. They were real, and they were not happy to be disturbed. The truth had begun to unravel, but was it too late to escape? The galaxy was about to find out. The awakening. Raxor's ship blasted off the surface of the dark planet, the engines roaring as the crew rushed back to safety. The towering ruins below were now shrouded in an eerie mist, and the distant howls echoed in the air. But even as the ship climbed higher into space, Raxor's mind raced with the strange events they had just witnessed. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had uncovered something far worse than just a ghost story. The Boogeymen were real, and they were angry. "Commander, what just happened down there?" Lieutenant Vora asked, her voice tinged with fear. It felt like the planet itself was alive. Raxor didn't answer right away. He was staring at the view screen, watching the planet grow smaller behind them. The signal had been a warning, and the planet's response had been nothing short of a threat. "I don't know," Raxor finally said, "but I do know one thing. We've woken something that was better left alone." The crew was silent, each member lost in their thoughts. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm was about to break. The Boogeymen were no longer a mere legend. They were real, and they were watching. But how far would they go to protect their secrets? As the ship left the planet's orbit, Raxor turned to his communications officer, Officer Kellen. "Run a full scan. I want to know if there are any other ships in the area. And I want to know what that signal really was." Kellen nodded, tapping at his console. "Scanning now, sir." The minutes dragged on as the crew waited for answers. The screen in front of them flickered before a map of the surrounding space appeared. But there was nothing. No ships, no signatures, nothing. Just empty space. "This doesn't make sense," Kellen muttered. "The signal, it came from nowhere." Raxor frowned. "You're telling me that signal didn't come from anywhere?" Kellen shook his head. "Not that I can find. It's as if it was beamed directly to us." "Commander." That sent a chill through the crew. The idea that something, or someone, could have reached them from such a great distance without detection was unsettling. But what bothered Raxor the most was the message itself. The Boogeymen were awake, and they were coming. "We need to prepare," Raxor said finally. "If they've been hiding all this time, there's no telling what they'll do if they find us again." But just as he finished speaking, the entire ship shuddered. The lights flickered. The alarms blared. "Damage report." Raxor barked, his heart racing. "Shields are down to 40%, Commander," Kellen yelled. "We're under attack." Raxor's eyes widened. "From where?" Kellen's hands flew across the controls, desperately trying to get a read on what was happening. But the screen remained blank. "There's nothing out there," Kellen said in confusion. That's when they all felt it. the deep resonating hum that came from the very heart of space itself. It was the same sound they had heard on the planet, the one that made the air feel thick with danger. Only now it was surrounding them. Suddenly, the ship was rocked by a violent blast, sending everyone stumbling. The walls trembled as the hull groaned under pressure. Raxer fought to stay standing, his mind racing to piece together what was happening. "They're here," he whispered. Another blast. The ship groaned, and alarms blared louder than before. "Braced for impact," Raxer shouted. The crew scrambled, trying to secure themselves as the ship was rocked again and again. Raxer could barely hear his own thoughts over the deafening noise. The Boogeymen hadn't just warned them, they were hunting them. In the distance, a shadowy form appeared on the ship's radar. It was massive, far larger than any known ship in the galaxy. Its shape was like nothing they had ever seen, smooth, almost organic, like it had grown instead of being built. The eerie hum grew louder as it drew closer, and the crew realized with growing horror that the ship was not trying to communicate. It was hunting. "We have to get out of here," Vora screamed. "Plata jumped to hyperspace," Raxer ordered. Kellen's hands flew over the controls, but the ship was too damaged. The engines sputtered, and the screen flickered once more. The shadowy ship was almost upon them. "Hyperspace drives not responding, sir," Kellen yelled, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't escape." "Hold on," Raxer yelled, pulling himself to his feet. "We'll fight. We can't let them take us without a fight." But even as he said it, he knew they were outmatched. The enemy ship was far beyond anything they had encountered. It wasn't just a weapon. It was alive. "Get to the weapons bay," Raxer ordered, trying to rally the crew. "We're not going down without a fight." The crew scrambled to their stations, but it was clear that no matter what they did, they couldn't outrun the threat that was now closing in on them. The Boogeymen were real, and they had come for them. But why? And what did they want? The answers were just out of reach, and Raxer feared they might never know. The Boogeymen unleashed. The lights on the ship flickered once again, and the whole crew was thrown into chaos. Raxer's mind raced as the deep hum of the approaching ship filled the air. The Boogeymen were no longer just a legend, a tale told to frighten children. They were real, and they were relentless. "Commander," Lieutenant Vora shouted over the commotion, her voice shaky. "We're being locked onto. There's no way to escape." Raxer's eyes darted to the control panels, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship's radar showed the shadowy form of the enemy vessel, its outline growing clearer by the second. The Boogeymen were upon them, and there was no turning back. "We need to fight back," Raxer ordered, his voice steely. "Prepare all weapons. Target their engines." But it was already too late. A sharp blast from the enemy ship rocked their vessel, sending everyone crashing to the floor. Sparks flew from the walls, and alarms blared as the ship shook violently. The crew scrambled to stay on their feet, trying to stay focused. "Shields are failing," Kellen yelled, desperately trying to keep the systems online. "We can't take another hit." Raxer clenched his fists. He had seen battle before, but this was something else. They were facing an enemy unlike anything they had ever encountered. The Boogeymen were not just soldiers. They were a force of nature, capable of wiping out entire fleets without breaking a sweat. "Get to the escape pods," Raxer ordered. "Everyone, get to safety." But just as the crew began to move, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the ship. It wasn't coming from any speaker or communication device. It was as if the voice itself was alive, reverberating in their very bones. "You cannot escape," the voice said. It was cold, metallic, and filled with an unnatural authority. "The Boogeymen do not let their prey run." Raxer froze. His breath caught in his throat as the reality of the situation set in. They weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting an entire legend, a being who had haunted the galaxy for centuries. The voice continued, its words cutting through the air like ice. Your kind has trespassed where it should not. Now, you will pay the price." Raxor's heart raced. He had to think fast. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the enemy seemed to know everything about them. Every move they made was anticipated. The Boogeymen were playing with them. "Return fire," Raxor shouted, trying to take control of the situation. "Target their weapons." But it was no use. The enemy ship's shields absorbed every blast they fired, and their weapons didn't even make a dent. The Boogeyman's ship was like a living creature, impervious to anything the crew could throw at it. "Commander, we got incoming," Vora warned, her voice tense with fear. Raxor looked up just in time to see something that made his blood run cold. From the enemy ship, a swarm of dark shapes detached and flew toward them. Small, fast-moving crafts, each one seeming to blend into the darkness of space. "They're launching fighters," Kellen shouted. The smaller ships descended upon them like a swarm of predators, each one moving with unnatural speed and precision. The crew fired their weapons, but the fighters seemed to dodge every shot with ease. Raxor watched in horror as one of the fighters locked onto their ship. A sudden explosion rocked the vessel, and the view screens flickered. The crew was thrown off balance as the entire ship shuddered under the attack. "Damage report," Raxor barked, trying to maintain control. "We've lost power to the engines," Kellen yelled, his hands flying over the control panel in a desperate attempt to fix the systems. "We're dead in the water, Commander." Raxor's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't fight these enemies off without help. He glanced toward the escape pods, but the Boogeymen had already sealed their fate. The enemy wasn't just fighting. They were hunting. "There's no time," Raxor said, his voice grim. "We have to make a stand." As the crew scrambled to defend the ship, Raxor's thoughts drifted back to the warning they had received, the message that the Boogeymen were coming. He had underestimated the threat. What he didn't know was how far the Boogeymen were willing to go to protect their secrets. And now it was too late to turn back. The enemy ship loomed larger on the screens, its dark, ghostly shape filled with an ancient menace. The Boogeymen were no longer just stories. They were the true rulers of this part of the galaxy, and they had come to claim what was theirs. "Prepare for boarding," the voice from the enemy ship said once again, cold and unforgiving. "You will join us, or you will perish." Raxor's hands tightened on the controls, his mind racing as he considered their options. They had no backup, no reinforcements. The Boogeymen had them exactly where they wanted them. But even as despair began to settle in, Raxor refused to give up. He wouldn't let his crew die without a fight. If they were going down, they would go down swinging. "We fight," he said, his voice unwavering. "We fight until the end." The battle for survival had only just begun. Into the abyss. The Boogeyman ship hovered above, casting an eerie shadow over Raxor's vessel. The crew was running out of options. Their weapons had failed. Their escape pods had been sealed. The Boogeymen had cornered them, and there was nowhere left to hide. Raxor paced back and forth, his mind racing for a solution. He glanced at the dimmed control panels, a faint glow showing the severity of the damage. The systems were barely holding up, and the enemy was closing in. He turned to Lieutenant Vora, his closest ally. "We're not dead yet," Raxor muttered, determination in his eyes. "Is there anything we can do? Anything at all?" Vora shook her head. "The shields are gone. Engines are offline. If we keep fighting, we're just going to waste what little resources we have left. They'll board us soon." "Then we need a new plan," Raxor said, his voice low but firm. "Can we send out a distress signal? Maybe someone will hear us." "I've tried, Commander. The Boogeymen have blocked all our communications," she replied. "There's nothing more we can do." Raxor clenched his fists. He couldn't just give up. Not after everything they had been through. He glanced out the window, his heart sinking as he saw the silhouettes of the smaller Boogeyman fighters circling around them, waiting for the kill. Suddenly, A thought struck him, an old strategy from his past. A risky one, but it might just be crazy enough to work. "Vora," he said, turning toward her with a spark of hope in his eyes. "We don't need to fight them head-on. We need to trick them. They think they've won, right?" Vora raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting, Commander?" "We'll let them board us, but we'll make them think it's easy. We'll lead them into a trap." Vora didn't hesitate. "I'll follow your lead, Commander. But how do we turn the tables?" Raxer nodded. "We take out their control center from the inside. If we can disable their systems, we might have a chance to escape, or at least cause enough chaos to buy us some time." It was a dangerous plan. If they failed, it would mean certain death. But Raxer was ready to gamble everything on it. He turned to the rest of the crew. "Listen up, everyone," he shouted. "The Boogeymen are going to board this ship, but we're not just going to wait for them to take us. We're going to lead them into the belly of the beast. Once they're aboard, we'll hit them where it hurts, right in their own ship." The crew exchanged nervous glances, but rallied behind him. They knew they had no other choice. Raxer's plan might just work if they could pull it off. The first wave of Boogeyman fighters darted toward their ship, making their move. Raxer gave the order to power down the remaining systems, hoping to make their ship appear abandoned. The Boogeymen would think they had surrendered. It was their only shot. The ship grew quiet as the lights dimmed. Raxer held his breath, waiting for the inevitable. Would they notice the trap? Would they be fooled by their feigned weakness? The air felt thick with tension as the fighters docked, and the first wave of soldiers began to board. Raxer's crew remained still, every heart pounding in their chest. Raxer gripped his weapon, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Then the first Boogeyman soldier stepped into the ship. It was taller than any human, its body encased in sleek black armor, reflecting the dim light. The creature's helmet gleamed with a cold, unfeeling aura. Its eyes, hidden behind the visor, scanned the surroundings with an unsettling precision. Raxer motioned for the crew to stay silent. The trap was set. They had to wait for the right moment. More soldiers followed, their footsteps heavy and methodical. The Boogeymen were everywhere, creeping through the hallways, expecting resistance, but finding none. The silence was deafening. And then Raxer heard it, a faint peeping sound. The signal was set. He and his crew had activated the hidden explosives deep within the ship's engine room, just beneath the Boogeyman's path. "Now," Raxer commanded. A sudden, blinding explosion rocked the entire ship. The force of it sent shockwaves through the walls, and the Boogeyman staggered, thrown off balance by the blast. The corridor lit up in flames as the crew rushed into action. "Fight back, now," Raxer ordered. Chaos erupted as the Boogeymen tried to regain their footing, but it was too late. The crew of Raxer's ship was ready. They attacked with everything they had, catching the enemy by surprise. The Boogeymen had come thinking they would crush them effortlessly, but instead they had walked into a trap. The Boogeyman soldiers fought back with brutal efficiency, their weapons flashing with deadly precision. But the crew had the advantage now, striking with unrelenting force. It was no longer a battle for survival. It was a battle for control of the ship. Raxer fought side by side with his crew, his weapon raised as he took down one Boogeyman after another. He had no time to think, no time to second-guess his actions. It was kill or be killed. But even as they fought, Raxer knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The Boogeymen would keep coming. They were a force of nature, relentless and unforgiving. The battle was far from over, but this small victory gave the crew something they hadn't had in days: hope. "We've got them on the run," Kellen shouted, his voice hoarse with excitement. Raxer nodded, but his thoughts were already racing ahead. This fight wasn't won yet. The Boogeymen were cunning, and they would be back. But for now, they had a moment of victory. And that would have to be enough. The crew regrouped, taking deep breaths as they prepared for the next wave. Raxor's mind raced, but he knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't go down without a fight. The unseen enemy. The battle had shifted in their favor, but Raxor knew this was only the beginning. The Boogeymen were relentless, and even though they had gained the upper hand in the initial confrontation, he could feel the weight of something much bigger coming. The dark force lurked in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. The corridors of their ship, now damaged from the blast, were filled with the sounds of the crew scrambling to secure their position. Raxor moved quickly, his boots echoing off the walls as he made his way to the ship's command center. He needed to understand what the Boogeymen were truly after. There had to be more to this than just their invasion. As he entered the command center, Lieutenant Vora looked up from the control panel. Her face was etched with worry. The atmosphere was tense, as if they were on the edge of a precipice. "Commander, we've got a problem," Vora said, her voice low but urgent. "The Boogeymen are still here, but there's something off about their movements. They're too organized, too calculated. They know exactly what we're doing, even before we do it." Raxor frowned. "They've been able to anticipate our every move. They seem to know us better than we know ourselves." Vora nodded, her fingers flying over the console. "It's not just that. I've been monitoring their comms, and they're communicating with someone, but it's not one of them. It's something else." Raxor's pulse quickened. The Boogeymen were part of an empire, but this felt different. Something was controlling them from the shadows. He knew that the power behind the Boogeymen was far more dangerous than the soldiers they'd already faced. "Who are they communicating with?" Raxor asked, his voice tight with concern. Vora paused for a moment before replying. "I don't know yet, but I've traced the signal. It's coming from deep within the heart of their fleet. There's a mothership, one much larger than we ever expected. It's beyond anything we've ever seen." Raxor's mind raced. He had heard rumors of ancient alien ships capable of wiping out entire star systems, but he never thought they would face one firsthand. This wasn't just an invasion. It was the beginning of something far worse. "We need to get to that mothership," Raxor said, his voice firm. "We can't let them call in reinforcements. If we destroy that ship, we stop this invasion for good." Vora looked at him, her face pale. "Commander, we don't have the resources for something like that. The mothership is heavily guarded, and we'd be outmatched before we even got close." Raxor's eyes hardened. He wasn't about to back down now. "Then we'll make our own way. We have one advantage. They think we're finished. If we can infiltrate their mothership, we might be able to turn the tide." Without waiting for a reply, Raxor turned and headed for the hangar. The crew quickly followed, preparing for their most dangerous mission yet. Their odds were slim, but this was their chance to take down the Boogeymen before they could summon their full force. As they moved through the corridors, Raxor couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. There was a presence, something so sinister and powerful that it sent chills down his spine. It was as if they were being led into a trap, and they didn't even know it. When they reached the hangar, Raxor was greeted by the sight of their last remaining fighter ship. It was small, barely capable of sustaining a long journey, but it was their only option. The crew worked quickly to prepare the ship for launch, checking systems, and loading weapons. They had no time to waste. "We leave now," Raxor ordered. "No one gets left behind." The engines roared to life as the small ship lifted off, leaving the safety of their damaged vessel behind. The Boogeyman's mothership loomed large ahead, a dark and foreboding presence in the distance. As they approached, the tension in the air grew thick. Raxor's hands gripped the controls tightly, his every sense alert. This was a one-way mission. If they couldn't infiltrate the mothership and disable its systems, they would never make it back. The ship flew through the void, silently slipping past the Boogeyman's defensive lines. They were unnoticed for now. The cold emptiness of space surrounded them, giving them the illusion of safety. But Raxor knew better. The enemy was watching, and it wouldn't be long before they noticed their presence. Then, without warning, the sensors flashed red. A dozen enemy ships materialized from the shadows, surrounding them in an instant. "Get us out of here," Vora shouted. But it was too late. The Boogeymen's fighters opened fire, their lasers lighting up the dark expanse of space. The small ship rocked violently, the hull shuddering under the onslaught. Raxor's heart raced as he pushed the ship's controls to the limit, evading the incoming fire as best as he could. "We're not going to make it," shouted one of the crew members. Raxor's voice was calm, though his mind raced. "Hold steady. We have one shot, if we can just reach the mothership." Before he could finish, a massive explosion shook the ship, sending them into a violent spin. The systems flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights flickered back on, Raxor was still in the pilot's seat, but the ship was tumbling through space, uncontrollable. The Boogeymen were closing in. "Commander, we're losing power," Vora yelled, struggling to regain control. But Raxor was already working the console, his mind focused on one goal: the mothership. They had no choice but to push forward, no matter what the cost. The Boogeymen were relentless, but Raxor was determined. The truth was out there, and they would not stop until they uncovered it. The heart of the mothership. The small ship hurtled toward the massive Boogeyman mothership, spinning uncontrollably as it dodged incoming enemy fire. Raxor's mind raced, calculating every move, but the odds of surviving this mission seemed slim. His crew had fought valiantly so far, but now they were flying straight into the heart of the Boogeyman's empire, a place no one had ever returned from. "Brace for impact," Raxor shouted, tightening his grip on the controls. He could see the mothership up ahead, its sheer size dwarfing everything around it. The dark, foreboding structure was surrounded by a swarm of smaller ships, all bent on keeping them away. But Raxor was determined. They had to reach the mothership's core. If they didn't, the Boogeymen would crush humanity once and for all. With a final, desperate push, he guided the ship toward a massive hangar bay. It was the only opening large enough for them to enter, and it seemed like their only chance to infiltrate the mothership without being obliterated by enemy fire. The ship was shaking violently, but Raxor held steady, steering them into the bay. Inside, the ship shuddered as it slammed onto the hangar floor. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the hull. The lights flickered, but they were alive. For a moment, there was only silence. The crew sat frozen, their hearts pounding, unsure if they had made it inside undetected. Then the alarms blared. The Boogeymen had found them. "Get to the core," Raxor barked, unbuckling his harness and jumping to his feet. "Move, now." The crew scrambled to grab their weapons and prepare for what was to come. Raxor led the way, charging down the hallway toward the center of the mothership. The entire ship seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were alive, aware of their every move. It was unnerving, but Raxor's determination fueled him. As they navigated the winding corridors, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Every shadow felt like a potential threat, every flicker of light a sign that the Boogeymen were closing in. The tension was unbearable. Then, they reached the central chamber. The room was vast, the size of a stadium, filled with glowing energy conduits and strange alien technology. At the center of it all stood a massive throne, unlike anything Raxor had ever seen. It was made of black metal, adorned with sharp, angular designs. On it sat a figure cloaked in darkness, their face hidden by a hood. The figure did not move, but Raxor could feel their presence. The Boogeymen weren't just soldiers, they were controlled by something much more powerful. And this figure, seated in front of them, was at the heart of it all. Raxor stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling in his chest. "Who are you? What are you doing to my people?" The figure remained silent, unmoving. The only sound was the hum of the energy running through the mothership, a constant reminder of the danger surrounding them. "Answer me," Raxor shouted, his frustration growing. but there was no reply. Then suddenly, the figure raised their hand, and the room trembled. The lights flickered again, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the darkness. A swarm of Boogeymen emerged from the shadows, their weapons raised, ready to strike. But something was different. They weren't attacking immediately. Instead, they stood in place, as if waiting for an order. Raxor's instincts kicked in. He raised his weapon and fired, but the shots had no effect. It was as if the Boogeymen were shielded by some unseen force. The figure on the throne had to be controlling them, and if they didn't stop this force soon, there would be no hope left for Earth. "We're outnumbered," Vora shouted from behind him. "We need to retreat." But Raxor shook his head. "There's no retreating now. We have to end this, once and for all." In a split second, the figure finally spoke, their voice deep and commanding. "You've come far, Commander, but this is where your journey ends." Raxor's heart raced. The voice was cold, full of power, and it sent a chill through his bones. This was the mastermind behind everything, the one who had been orchestrating the destruction of humanity. "You will never defeat me," the figure continued, standing slowly from their throne. "The Boogeymen are merely tools in my hands, and now that you've come to me, you will be nothing more than another casualty in my war." Raxor tightened his grip on his weapon, knowing they had no choice but to fight. The Boogeymen were closing in, their weapons drawn. But Raxor wasn't afraid anymore. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath. The crew raised their weapons, preparing for a battle unlike any they had faced before. The Boogeymen advanced, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and Raxor knew this would be their final stand. If they didn't defeat this mysterious force, humanity's future was doomed. As the first shots rang out, Raxor and his crew rushed into the fray, determined to put an end to the nightmare. The battle for humanity's survival had reached its peak, and the stakes had never been higher. The final stand. The battle raged on, and the room was filled with chaos. Explosions echoed as energy blasts collided with walls and floors. The Boogeymen advanced with ruthless precision, their cold, glowing eyes never wavering. Raxor and his crew fought with everything they had, but they were outnumbered, and their weapons seemed ineffective against the seemingly invincible aliens. Raxor ducked behind a pillar, trying to catch his breath. The adrenaline surged through his veins, but his mind was racing. They needed to find a way to disable the mysterious figure controlling the Boogeymen. If they didn't, they would be overwhelmed, and humanity's last hope would be lost. "You need to hit him directly," Vora shouted, her voice hoarse from the smoke and dust. She was fighting beside him, taking down Boogeymen one by one, but it was clear the battle wasn't in their favor. "The figure on the throne. It's him controlling them. We have to stop him." Raxor's eyes darted across the room, locking onto the dark figure on the throne. The figure, still seated, had not moved much during the fight, but the energy surrounding him pulsed with power. Every time a Boogeyman fell, the figure's hand would twitch, and the fallen warriors would rise again, as if the battle were just a game. "Raxor," Vora shouted again, snapping him from his thoughts. "We need to take him out. Now." Raxor nodded, understanding what had to be done. He motioned to his crew, signaling for them to push forward. It was time for a final assault. With weapons raised, the crew surged forward, cutting through the enemy forces. Raxor led the charge, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure on the throne was still eerily calm, but Raxor could feel the energy in the room shifting. This was it. This was their last chance. The Boogeymen seemed to sense their determination and closed in tighter, forming a protective ring around the figure. But Raxor's crew didn't slow down. They fought with fury, pushing the Boogeymen back, determined to reach their target. As Raxor neared the throne, the figure finally moved. He stood, his cloak floating like shadow, revealing a tall, imposing form. The Boogeymen stopped moving, their eyes now fixed on the figure, as if awaiting instructions. The silence in the room was deafening. "You've made it this far," the figure's voice rang out, deep and cold. "But it is futile. You will not win." Raxer stopped, just a few paces away from the figure. He could feel the weight of the words, the crushing sense of inevitability that the figure exuded. But he didn't falter. "We've already won," Raxer said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "Humanity will never bow to the likes of you." The figure laughed, a low, sinister chuckle that echoed throughout the chamber. "You believe you've won, Commander. You think that destroying me will stop the Boogeymen. You are nothing compared to the power that lies within me." Raxer narrowed his eyes. The figure wasn't just controlling the Boogeymen. He was their creator, their leader. And now he was the last obstacle between humanity and survival. "You're wrong," Raxer said. "Humanity is more than you can ever understand. We don't give up. We fight until the very end." Without warning, the figure raised his hand, and a surge of energy shot out toward Raxer, the force of it enough to send him flying backward. The ground shook as the energy crackled and sparked, sending his crew scattering. But they weren't finished. Raxer, though dazed, got back on his feet. His crew rallied around him, ready to fight until their last breath. Together, they advanced on the figure, fighting through the Boogeymen who now swarmed around them. The battle was fierce. The crew was outmatched, but Raxer's will to protect Earth drove him forward. They'd reached the figure, pushing through the alien forces, and with one final, desperate strike, Raxer lunged, piercing the figure's chest with his weapon. The figure gasped, his dark eyes widening in shock. The energy around him began to wane, and the Boogeyman, now without a master, faltered. "No," the figure whispered, his body crumbling to dust. "This cannot be." With the figure's death, the Boogeymen collapsed, their eyes losing their eerie glow. The room was silent for a moment, the battle finally over. Raxer stood over the ashes of the dark figure, breathing heavily, bloodied and bruised but victorious. His crew gathered around him, equally battered but alive. They had done it. They had destroyed the heart of the Boogeyman Empire and freed the galaxy from their grip. "It's over," Vora said softly, her voice full of relief. Raxer nodded. "We've saved Earth. And now, we rebuild." The crew stood together, a sense of pride and triumph settling over them. The Boogeymen were no more, and humanity had survived. They had proven that no matter how dark the odds, no matter how powerful the enemy, the human spirit could never be defeated. The galaxy had learned a hard truth that day. Earth would never be the prey. It was a force to be reckoned with. And as long as humanity stood united, nothing could ever break their will.